There must be some interest in American history out there. On the morning of March 6, 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, the man on the right here, who's quite prettied up in this painting, was 80 years old. It was 2 days after the inauguration of James Buchanan as the 15th President of the United States, a Pennsylvanian, a Democrat. Some Northerners called him a doughface because he was so pro-slavery. But Chief Justice Taney stood in the old Supreme Court chamber in the United States Capitol, which is on the second floor. It's still there. It's like a museum now. The room was full of a crowd of reporters and spectators. There were people out in the halls who couldn't fit in. And Justice Taney got up and read a 55-page majority opinion in Dred Scott v. John Sanford. Taney had been born during the American Revolution. There's another continuity, Joanne. He could still take over a room. He was a bit enfeebled by then, but he could still kind of take over a room, and that day he did. Dred Scott's name, it's Dred on the left in a painting. We have photographs of him as well, though. His name was by then actually well known to Americans. The 4 days of debate over the Dred Scott, what would become the Dred Scott decision, had been conducted back in December of '56, and it had a tremendous coverage in national newspapers all over the country. It was clear from the beginning this case could be taken to quite some extent if the judges decided, and they will decide that. Could this man and his wife Harriet and their 2 children, who had been born in Minnesota territory, free territory, could this man, a slave from originally Virginia, who had emigrated out to Missouri, but went with his owner, a Dr. Emerson, a physician, into Illinois and then up into Minnesota territory to an American military base, Fort Snelling. Could he use that residence on free soil to sue for his freedom? And what would it mean if they said yes to this whole swirling, extremely difficult crisis the country has by then, over the expansion of slavery into the West? What about the sacred pledge of the old Missouri Compromise line from 1820 that had determined that the 3630-degree parallel slavery shall never exist north of it? Well, Illinois and Fort Snelling are definitely north of it. Northerners, especially this new Republican Party, and a bit more on its origin as we flash back, had always considered the Missouri Compromise line a, quote, sacred pledge, not to be messed with, invulnerable. Free soil had come to mean a free future, a free labor future. This growing nation, massive expansion, needed answers to its greatest social and political problem. In Taney's decision, very quickly up front, those journalists who were there and the people in that hall realized it's going to be a big decision because they could hear it right away, as Taney said. Black people, he said Negroes, could never be citizens nor considered, quote, as part of the people. The room stirred as listeners recognized Taney might go big. He said, quote, every citizen has a right to take with him into a territory any article of property The Constitution, said Taney, of the United States recognizes slaves as property and pledges the federal government to protect it. Fifth Amendment, the right to own and transport your property anywhere you wish in the jurisdiction of the United States. The Fifth Amendment will always be contended for by both sides in this debate, because the Fifth Amendment also has due process in it. When Frederick Douglass said in the 1850s, America is its contradictions, all made up of its contradictions, he had a lot of material to work with. That was one. Fifth Amendment was an utter contradiction when it was drafted. Taney went on, and in the most famous statement or inclusion, he simply said that black people had never been and could never be citizens of the United States, and that they had, quote, for more than a century been regarded as beings of an inferior order, so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Nothing ambiguous about the Dred Scott decision as Taney pushed it to a 7-2 majority of the Supreme Court. You think our Supreme Court's politicized? It is. But so was this one. 7 of the 9 justices had either been slaveholders, as was Taney himself, although he had freed his, or they were decidedly and openly pro-slavery. All had been appointed by pro-slavery presidents, dating back to Tyler and Polk. This was a decision now that the press, the country, awaited, but frankly was still shocked. Southerners were pleasingly shocked, as noted in a New Orleans newspaper, the Daily Picayune, that said they celebrated the court, quote, for adjudging the vexed question of the times as to rebuke faction and consolidate the Union for all time. This was going to settle it. All the brouhahas, all the fights, the debates, the struggles, the violence on the floor of the Congress, this is going to settle it. It's the Supreme Court. But that's not what northern newspapers are saying, and it sure as the Dickens wasn't what Republicans were saying. The New York Herald Tribune called the decision, quote, atrocious, wicked, and abominable. We don't use abominable much anymore. It's kind of a 19th century word. Maybe we need that back. Chicago Daily Tribune declared that Illinois could no longer prevent someone from, quote, opening a slave pen and an auction block for the sale of black men, women, and children right here in Chicago. And the New York Times saw the ruling as a revolution against the federal government. Slavery, it said, is no longer local, it's national. And they weren't wrong. And it's exactly what pro-slavery Southerners had wanted for so long. I will return to Dred Scott. Oldest trick in the book, you start where you're going to end, right? But let's back up. What's this fuss all about? Why were Americans so worried about slavery in the territories? Stephen Douglas once said, it's an imaginary debate about an imaginary Negro in an imaginary place. No, Stephen, you underestimated that one. He's going to be the author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, one of the biggest players in that. Look at the map The red territories, the red states are all slave states. Indian territory will be slave territory, and the Indian nations in Indian territory indeed became slaveholders, to say the least, and they will be very divided when the Civil War comes. That's another story. The United States is now going to have to decide what to do with California. As I said earlier, the Kansas and Nebraska territories are everything that's left of the old Louisiana Purchase. That's the brown area, the darker brown area, the New Mexico territory, the Utah territory. California is shown here already in the Union. It's not until 1850. This is the vast West now. What's going to happen to that Mexican cession? All that land gained from Mexico. How will it be settled? Who decides? These three guys tried. This was not a fashion ad. It was not a Halloween poster. It is the great triumvirate. Henry Clay on the left, Daniel Webster in the middle, and who's the other one? Calhoun. Never to be forgotten at Yale University, probably. Why all the fuss, though? What's the fuss over slavery in the West? Well, let's get at that quickly. I had up some ideas on the screen the other day. For the North, by this time now, by the 1840s and into the 1850s, there was the belief that slavery, slave labor, which so many Northerners are now going to associate with the denigration of free labor, free white labor, that it could easily take hold out in the Southwest. It could be used in mining. Cotton was already growing in Texas. That the Southwest could become a cotton or a slave kingdom of its own kind. Secondly, they too took constitutional grounds. This is the problem. Next week when I talk about secession, I'll talk about the two constitutions that were in struggle with one another. Northerners are going to say that, Fifth Amendment is also about due process. That it's up to the people, it's up to a state to decide whether they want to have slavery. The federal government cannot just determine it. Non-extension of slavery becomes now a cluster of arguments, sometimes ambiguous, sometimes explicit, as a way of ultimately containing slavery and therefore destroying it. And Southerners are listening. There were already bills in Congress for the territorial organization of Utah and New Mexico, and they were offensive to many Northerners because they were simply being asked for their complicity to spread slavery. And there were Northern congressmen now in the wake of the Mexican War who simply said, no, we're not going to vote for that. We're not going to help you get more representation. We're not going to help you make slavery national. We're going to try to keep it local. Then there was racism. There were a whole bunch of Northerners, immigrants, and others who wanted to keep black people out of the West. They're not everybody by any means, but they're there. Contradictions make the world go round. Free soil, that slogan, that carrion call, for many people did mean free white farmers with free soil. And then lastly, there's an abolition movement in the North. Haven't focused on it very much, but it's been around now. An organized anti-slavery movement has been around since the American Revolution. It really got traction in the 1820s, even a bit before that. It really gets traction in the 1820s and 1830s. William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator was founded in 1831 up in Boston, the longest-lasting abolitionist newspaper of all. It lasted 34 years. Frederick Douglass's newspaper, which went under 3 different names, lasted the longest of any black newspaper, from 1847 to 1863. Started as the North Star up in Rochester. There were other black abolitionist newspapers. There were state abolition societies, local anti-slavery societies. There were regions, especially upstate New York, known as the Burned Over District, where there were anti-slavery towns, where abolitionists were actually welcome by the 1850s. They weren't generally welcome most places. So there was a moral aversion to slavery in America's future, too. Add all that together, and that Republican Party that's going to be born out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to pull that coalition together in the most potent political coalition in American history, at least in its speed of taking office. You want to build a new coalition? You want to win elections? Go study the original Republican Party, not the current one. I don't mean that as a joke, but it's changed. For the South, what's their fuss about here? What's their argument? Many. They believe they have to expand or die, and they weren't wrong. They believe that the slave system, slave labor, plantation agriculture, the cotton kingdom needed to sugar kingdom needed to grow to survive. That's why they were so interested in annexing Cuba, and no less than 4 presidential administrations from the late 1840s to 1860 attempted efforts to annex Cuba, the largest sugar-growing place on planet Earth. And had that happened, we might have a different history. They also knew that they were sitting on something the world was criticizing, more than criticizing, condemning, and it was growing. And it was extraordinarily wealthy. But if it didn't grow and it couldn't have safety valves to get out of its edges, it might become a powder keg. It could become a danger, a burden to the South. Secondly, they wanted political parity. The only way you get political parity in a society where you have a lesser population is by keeping equality in the U.S. Senate. Hence, new states, as many states as they could get out of that Mexican cession. They were deeply interested in Latin American and Caribbean expansion, as I just mentioned. And lastly, 2 things. Congressional power. Power. If they could hold on to the presidency, which they've done very well at, including throughout the 1850s, yes, some Northerners are getting elected president, named Millard Fillmore and Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan. These people you know next to nothing about because they seem so nondescript. Actually, Franklin Pierce was an interesting character, and many said he was the most handsome of all American presidents. You'd think that would get him some attention today. A guy from upper New England who was pro-slavery, that's one contradiction. He had plenty of them. He was also in a famous and horrific train accident. There's a group out there planning a book of essays on all of the American presidents for the 2026. I think it's the Smithsonian Project. They asked me to write, and then they told me I was writing on Franklin Pierce. Thanks a lot. You got Nixon. Oh, you got a problem, Bev. Holy God. Oh, well, I got a piece of cake because nobody knows anything about Franklin Pierce, except he had a bad train accident. I'm over in the library. They're checking out books on Franklin Pierce. They're only about 2. You got a problem. Anyway. Last but not least here, Southerners have come to realize, and they're going to tell their Northern colleagues this every chance they get, that the legal status of slavery in the Western territories always stood for them as a measure of its moral standing everywhere. You condemn slavery in the West, you condemn slavery in Utah Territory, you're condemning it in Alabama. And we ain't going to take it. Our honor is at stake. You tell me you hate people who raise dogs in their backyard? That means you hate my dog. I don't mess with my dog. What are they going to do about it? There were 3 or 4 options that came on the table. They're all there on the table. When Clay and Webster go off and swill bourbon until they came up with these compromise measures, and then the Congress votes on it. And they're still going to have basically these options at the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The first was known as the Wilmot Proviso. It was up on the screen the other day. David Wilmot, W-I-L-M-O-T, was a Democrat, a racist, generally till then a pro-slavery Pennsylvanian Democrat. But the Mexican War changed him. He thought it was a war for westward expansion, the expansion of slavery, and he was offended by it. He gets up in the Congress in 1846, and he proposes this simple resolution. He said, in any land gained from Mexico, however much it is, slavery shall never exist. Take that, pro-slavery Southerners. The Wilmot Proviso became a resolution that the Congress kept voting on I forget how many times, over and over and over into the coming years. It would pass the House because Northerners had a majority. In fact, on its first time out, it passed 83 to 64 in the House. That's pretty good. But it never passed the Senate, where the South is keeping this parity. And not all Northerners were fond of it. That Wilmot positions, as it was called, the Wilmot Proviso position, was saying, okay, you can have your war of expansion, but that's not going to be slave territory. All that land, millions of acres, no new slave states. And Southerners are saying, nope, never do we agree on that. A second position was, of course, the South's position. We call it state sovereignty. It just means states' rights. It means that a man's individual constitutional right to take his slave property anywhere he wishes is paramount. No questions asked. No compromise with property rights in man, humans. It was championed vehemently and eloquently by John C. Calhoun. You will see that I have made up the issue between North and South, said Calhoun in a speech in 1847. If we flinch, we are gone. But if we stand fast on it, we shall triumph, either by compelling the North to yield to our terms or by declaring our independence. As early as 1847, midst of the Mexican War, Calhoun says, never give in to this idea of a Wilmot Proviso. The third possible option was very beguiling. And it's going to win the day for a while, both in the Compromise of 1850 and in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And it's still going to be around out there in Kansas as they're having a border civil war trying to figure out how to settle a slave territory or a free territory. It was called popular sovereignty, and it had this kind of lovely appeal to it. Popular sovereignty meant a referendum. Just let the people decide. If you create a new territory somewhere, wherever it is, Utah, Kansas, hold a vote. If slavery's voted in as the labor system, it's a slave state. If it's voted out, it's a free state. Sounds good. The problem was, when do you hold that vote? Early in the territorial process? Later in the territorial process? How much time do you give slaveholders to bring their slaves to the territory? It takes them a little longer. What if everybody just starts competing to get there first? And what if people start stuffing ballot boxes? What if they have voter fraud? I mean, real voter fraud. And they did. But popular sovereignty had what the great David Potter called the charm of ambiguity. Just let the people vote. It's your state. Social Security, it's your money. Privatize it. This idea of referendums are democratic. But sometimes you can be really scared of one if you know you're not going to win it, because it has the power of law. There was a fourth option always out there, hanging out there, and these guys thought about this too. It was to somehow reinforce that Missouri line. Remember the 1820 Missouri Compromise draws this line across the continent at the 3630 parallel. All land north of that can never have slavery. And it's most of the north, most of the West. So this got debated too in 1850. Like, well, why don't we just, get a magic marker and just deepen that line somehow, reinforce it legally. It was already law. Oh, man. Comes 1850. And what happened in 1849? The discovery of gold in California, of course. And there's this massive exodus of people, not just from the eastern United States, north and south, but from all over the world, going to California. They're going by sea. They're going by land. God knows how they all got there. And they're going to pan for gold. And within 1 year, California has enough people to become a new state. But you know how big California is. You saw it there on the map. Would California become 2 states? 1 slave, 1 free? Would it become all 1 state? How about 4 states? A whole lot of people today would probably like to break up California. More senators, one way or the other. One of our parties would probably want to make Orange County into a state, and then San Francisco into 2 states or something. I don't know. But California was the test question, as Calhoun said in speech after speech. It's the test, they say. You bring California in as a free state and we're out. Now, Calhoun didn't have everybody with him just yet. But what to do about California? What to do about a new big issue that's in Washington, D.C., and that is the domestic slave trade. 2 blocks from the U.S. Capitol, right today where Union Station is, you know where Union Station is if you've ever gone to Washington, was one of the largest slave trading pens in the United States. You could smell it when the wind was right or wrong up at the Capitol. Slaves were bought and sold there every day. And by 1850, there were a few abolitionists in the Congress and a few other Northerners who just didn't like it. And they were interested in some kind of federal action against the domestic slave trade, if they could. And then think back to that map I had just a bit earlier. Yeah. What about Texas? Texas was always bigger in the imagination than it actually is, but it's really big in reality as well as the imagination. Would Texas be 1 state, or might the boundary be redrawn and make it 2 states? That might please the South. What to do about the Texas boundary? 4th, and most important, Southerners have been demanding for years a stronger federal fugitive slave law. And this, Clay went to Daniel Webster, the great Whig from Massachusetts, not really an abolitionist, but sympathetic to the anti-slavery movement and one of the greatest orators in all of American history. He has some competitors. Henry Clay from Kentucky, founder in some ways of the Whig Party, a great politician, founder of the American Colonization Society, too, that would relocate black people out of the United States to Africa and elsewhere, but a moderate in many ways about issues of federal power, states' rights, and even slavery to some extent. There are reasons Abraham Lincoln grew up a devotee of Henry Clay. Clay went to Webster and said, "Daniel, we got to have a new Fugitive Slave Act." And Webster told him, "Can't do it. Massachusetts, it won't play. Can't do it. I can't take that home." And Clay said, "You have to. We're going to make a compromise here. We got to give the South a new Fugitive Slave Act," and they will. And then there's this 5th part. So there are 5 parts of the Compromise of 1850. And yes, it's worth writing down for purposes of exams and papers and whatever. Students among us, why not? You should grow up and for all time know the 5 parts of the Compromise of 1850. It's good talk at Thanksgiving when your uncle is babbling on and the Lions game is over. The first was they will admit California as a free state and not break it up. Bad news for the South. The second was they're going to abolish the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Only in the District of Columbia where Congress has jurisdiction. The North's going to like that too. That's 2 for the North, none for that's 2-0 North. And then third, this was one of Clay's ideas. You move the border of Texas back about 400 miles. West Texas is big. Move it back about 400 miles. You create a new state out of that. You call it New Mexico or whatever you want to call it. And you pay Texas $10 million. And now you got the potential of 2, 3, or more states. There could be slave states out of that Mexican cession. Could be 4 or 5, depending how far north you go with that boundary. Southerners are saying, yeah, they're counting the senators now. Fourth is the Fugitive Slave Act. One of the most pivotal, important, and disastrous laws ever passed in American history. It was a law that set up a system of magistrates across the northern states, and especially the border states, who were given federal authority now to run courts to adjudicate cases of fugitive slaves. If a slave owner from Kentucky or Virginia or anywhere comes into Ohio or Pennsylvania and finds his former slave or claims he does, he can go to that court, claim him, show evidence, and the slave will be returned to him. But they wanted to put incentive in this, so these special magistrates who were created just for fugitive slave courts were paid $10 when they, quote-unquote, convicted the fugitive and $5 if they acquitted him. Yeah, I know, that doesn't sound fair. It's not. And it wasn't intended to be. It was incentive for Southerners to vote for this. In the course of its existence, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act remanded about 370-odd former slaves, not that many, to former owners and sent back to the South. The Fugitive Slave Act, though, led to thousands of escapes, thousands of former slaves finding some way, yes, Underground Railroad, but many other means that nobody called Underground Railroad, to get into free territory, to get into free states, to get into the North. And it eventually causes a wave of free black Northerners moving into Canada. An estimated 20,000, it could have been more, African Americans moved across the Canadian border just in the first 5 years of the 1850s. And whole towns and communities that are still black communities in Ontario were founded in those years. It caused an exodus. Frederick Douglass likened it, he said, to a dark train going out of the land as if fleeing from death. He would know. He lived up in Rochester, New York. By his own count, he helped approximately 100 fugitives through his own house up to the dock on the Erie River and off into Hamilton, Ontario, Toronto, and Niagara Falls, and other places. This package, though, the 5 parts of the Compromise of 1850, was presented to the Congress and the Senate by these 3 giants. I'll do this quickly. Henry Clay, the great Kentuckian who has so many places and moments in American history, some Some great, some not, depending on how you judge all these things. But when Clay got up to speak on the 4th of March in favor of this package, the Clay Compromises, as they were called, he had a lot of clout. He was Mr. Whig. And he held up a piece of wood, and he said it was a piece of George Washington's coffin. A piece of the true cross of America's secular religion. It's a piece of George Washington's coffin, and on George Washington's coffin, you must vote to preserve the Union. You won't like all of this, my fellow Northerners, my fellow Southerners, my fellow Whigs, my fellow Democrats. You won't like all of this, but you have to go for this. He appealed to the heart, and he appealed to history. He had him weeping. I don't know whatever happened to that piece of twig, but somebody finds it, man. Whoa. Daniel Webster was also a Whig. He was a great lawyer and orator, as I said. He'd been in the Congress since 1823. He was a titan. All these guys could carry people with them, carry votes. He'd been in the Senate since 1844. He was famous for his debates during the nullification crisis back in 1830-31. They're standing up to Andrew Jackson, famously when he said, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." Webster had always been this voice of union, the voice of the nation, holding it together. He was a strong supporter of the Wilmot Proviso. He had a lot of friends among the abolitionists. He was worried whether he could go home. He speaks on the 7th of March. "I wish to speak today not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for the preservation of the Union." And then he went into metaphors from nature and the American experiment. Nature and the rivers, the mountains, the land, the glory of America. You must save it now, or it'll all fly apart. And then there was Calhoun. Calhoun was dying by the spring of 1850. He will be dead in early 51. Webster will die soon after that, as did Clay. These guys are on their way out. Students, you've been assigned just a short portion of Calhoun's speech that he gave on the floor of Congress. He didn't give it. He was carried in. He was carried in on a chair, and they sat him down. It was read for him by Senator Mason of Virginia. He'd been everything but president. He'd been senator, vice president, secretary of state. He'd been in both parties. He was Calhoun. And there's a reason he had his name on a college here by the 1930s. Yale University only had one president, that was William Howard Taft, and Taft was on the outs with Yale, as I read the documents, and the Taft family wasn't going to get honored. And the only vice president Yale ever had was John C. Calhoun. So Calhoun College, it was sort of a no-brainer in 1933. In this great speech to Congress, though, Calhoun wanted nothing to do with compromises. He didn't even mention the Clay measures. He made a propaganda speech for Southern nationalism. It was a brilliant appeal, rhetorically. He put all of the onus, all of the blame on the North for pushing this and pushing this and pushing this. He didn't even mention slavery, which is what the whole damn thing was about. Sort of like the Constitution. He said this was a question of power, and the North, the larger section, was running roughshod, he said, over the South and its rights and its liberties. The South must protect itself, Calhoun argued over and over in eloquent ways, and he threatened secession if they did not get their way. It's not clear that he had all of Southern representatives and senators with him at that moment. It's just not completely clear. But what we do know is he scared some Northerners into voting for the compromise just to keep the lid on the thing. You know, sometimes you ever been in organizations where you kind of vote for a compromise you hate, but the alternative is kind of uglier? It passed, but the only way it passed is not by voting on the whole 5 parts of it. This classic parliamentary maneuver. And that maneuver was conducted by Stephen Douglas. Senator young, only 40 years old, 38 at this point, from Illinois, a Democrat, kind of pro-slavery, but he mostly just tried to avoid the question. It's nothing but an imaginary slave in an imaginary place and all that. But he was a damn good parliamentarian. He said, we cannot vote on each of these individually because there's somebody who's going to vote against them. Each one's going to lose if you vote on them individually. Each one's going to vote if you vote on them as an omnibus bill, because somebody hates something. Everybody hates something in the bill. So vote on them one by one by one and pull arms, make bribes, threaten, whatever you have to do to get a tiny majority on each one of those. Never let them vote on it as an omnibus. And all 5 Clay measures passed narrowly. And it was quickly called by late August the Great Compromise of 1850. The Clay Compromise became the Great Compromise. The Union had been saved. There were parades in cities. The Union had survived. But David Potter again put it really well when he said it was more of an armistice than a real compromise, because now they had to figure out what to do with all the rest of that West, and they had to do it soon because Kansas and Nebraska were ready. They're going to be ready quickly. And in the climate of 1851, 52, and 53, this issue of slavery out there and what's left of the old Louisiana Purchase, remember that whole huge expanse of land, which is not desert, not full of Gila monsters and sand hills, it's good land. They got to decide what to do with it. And there's got to be a bill. I guess who was chair of the Western Territories Committee in the U.S. Senate? Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas was chair. It began as a debate over the Transcontinental Railroad. That's how early they were debating this idea of an eastern terminus of a transcontinental, or maybe 2 transcontinentals. Where would they start? How far would they go? What would the routes be? It began as a debate over that, but it quickly became a debate over slavery in Kansas and Nebraska. Douglas wrote 3 different bills. 3. Most moderate to most radical. And here's simply what happened. First, he wrote a bill trying to keep the slavery issue suppressed. You got a terrible issue. You try to suppress it and talk about something else. It's like families. Well, or sort of like family. The first bill was very simple. It was just going to say, a state shall be admitted for these territories, quote, with or without slavery. Okay? But how? It didn't say. Sometimes in politics, keep it vague. If nobody understands, you might get something done. No. Pro-slavery Southerners said, Stephen, that isn't even close. So he came up with a second bill. And he moved to a direct statement of popular sovereignty. Quote, the decision shall be left to the people residing therein. There will be a referendum. He promises that. Popular sovereignty will be the method, be the means, settling Kansas-Nebraska. The planters, slave-owning senators, now they took Stephen Douglas for a carriage ride, two of them, around Washington. Senator Dixon in particular, Archibald Dixon, a Kentucky Whig from the other party, in effect, took Stephen Douglas to the shed, said, nope, you must repeal the Missouri line of 1820. You must erase that territorial division forever. And Stephen Douglas didn't want to do it, but he finally said in that carriage ride, and we have good evidence of this, by God, sir, you are right. I will incorporate it into my bill, though I know it will raise a hell of a storm. It may be hard to grasp today. Why would how to settle the Kansas-Nebraska territories blow up American political culture overnight? Why were so many people out of their brains over this? Why did it lead almost immediately to a new political party? The Republican Party, as we now call it, didn't exist at the beginning of 1854. It's going to be a viable national party by the end of the summer of 1854. It was born in, take your pick, any number of Midwestern cities like Hillsdale, Michigan, Beloit, Wisconsin. They all claim to be the place where the first Republic. Jackson, Michigan claims it too. They all want to be the first place the Republicans held a meeting. They came together to oppose the Kansas-Nebraska Act, to oppose the expansion of slavery into the West forever, to cordon off slavery. They came together to try to organize a political coalition to create a free labor future for the United States. And they were a motley coalition. They were a lot of former Whigs now who are losing their party, and the Whig party is actually dying, and a number of Northern Democrats who don't like this. They hate this. They didn't like the Mexican War. They don't like Stephen Douglas. They don't like this. And then there's the abolitionists who are growing in strength. And then there's even a fourth group now who are really potent. They're known as the Know-Nothings, which was the American xenophobic party. Actually, their formal name was the American Party. They were against immigration of all kinds. They were especially against that Irish immigration. There's only one thing a Midwestern farmer feared more than a disease that would get his cows, and that was that his daughter wanted to marry an Irishman. No offense. Isn't it terrible how you can get away with Irish jokes still? It's not right. But anyway, this Republican Party is born now to oppose this law that went into effect and led rather quickly to the outbreak of a kind of border civil war in Kansas. We call it Bleeding Kansas. It will eventually give us John Brown, but it gave that region terrible loss of life and treasure. Over 200 people were killed. It's just a village against village, farm against farm. Free soilers versus pro-slavery folks doing butchery on each other. And all of this is the backdrop, by the way, for that old man named Dred Scott, whose case has been working its way through local courts. He first went to a circuit court in St. Louis and appealed on the basis of free soil. His residence in Illinois and up in Minnesota Territory should give him his freedom. The circuit court said no. But Dred Scott had friends now. He had anti-slavery friends even in Missouri, especially across the river in Illinois, and they appealed it to the Missouri Supreme Court. And the Missouri Supreme Court had 3 justices, and they voted 2-1 to free him. But of course, that's not going to end there, because that got appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. It didn't even get on the docket until 1854. But the next 3 years, the court started to take up this, and others like it. There had been other freedom suits, many of them actually, at the local level. This one had national potential, and the way we see that, and I'll leave you here, is that when the lawyers line up for the Dred Scott decision, it was 4 of the greatest lawyers in America. I'll tell you more about them next time. But this case was many years in its incubation, many years in its sort of legal and historical research. And ask anybody today, almost anybody, poor old Chief Justice Taney is not only going to get his law wrong, he's really going to get his history wrong. That's why I had you read Taney's, or a portion of Taney's speech, and then the dissent, one of the 2 dissents on the court in the 7-2 decision. And if you read those carefully, you'll see these people are not only polarized, they have no middle ground. The great significance of Dred Scott, and I'll start with this next time, is that it's going to ruin the middle. Whatever middle is left about the future of slavery, it's going to ruin moderation, it's going to ruin debate, it's going to ruin any middle. And that Republican Party is now going to devote itself to running to control Congress and eventually the presidency based on the Dred Scott decision. There's never been a Supreme Court decision, I don't think even Roe, which ends up in Dobbs, that dominated the sensibilities and the votes of political parties quite like Dred Scott. Thank you.